The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hi, and welcome to this week's live broadcast of the Revelation Show here with myself, your host, Paul Stevenson, on this Friday, the 21st of October. I'll be with you live here for the next 2 hours. That's 7 to 9 p.m. UK time. If you're in the Eastern Standard Time, it's 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific time is 11 till 1 p.m. And coming up in the show, hopefully, because there's a couple of little technical issues, I have the founder, one of the founders of a Christian apologetics ministry called American Vision. He's certainly well known within Christian circles, possibly even in wider circles, because he's very well known for discussing the topic of end times. Big questions, very, very popular today. Books like Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, and an issue which transcends the Christianity really and goes into the popular culture. We see lots of films, lots of books, and about the end times, the current modern state of Israel being a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Lots of speculation about who the Antichrist is. Is it Barack Obama? Is it Hillary Clinton? Is it Vladimir Putin? Who's the great beast of Revelation? Is it the Catholic Church? And all manner of speculation on this topic. And I have a guy today who's a biblical expert, a scholar certainly of the Bible and the Scriptures. And I'm going to be talking to him today about what the Bible actually says about these issues, and whether we are actually in the end times, whether this is close to the reality, or whether we're off the mark. The same discussion about modern day Israel being a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. We all know that many in the church believe that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It's a topic which is not without controversy, but many dogmatically believe it is, and that Israel is being protected by God and has to deal with all sorts of enemies in the Middle East. And after 2,000 years, it's seen as a miraculous, ostensibly a miraculous God-driven event, which has returned the Jews to their homeland. So we're going to discuss all those types of topics this afternoon. As I say, I'm just waiting for Mr. Demar. It's great to have you on, Gary. I'm thrilled to make your acquaintance. How are you doing? Are you busy?
I'm ready.
Okay. So, I mean, I've introduced you. I've let the audience know that you're the founder of American Vision, aren't you?
Well, I was actually hired by some person who founded it back in 1980, and we were doing particularly worldview. He was doing America's Christian history, and I wanted to bring worldview issues in, and then the issue of eschatology came up. So I've been there since 1980, so it was that 36 years. Right,
okay. Well, it's a very impressive website. You obviously do you do that full time? Because you've got, there's a lot of stuff on there. I mean, somebody's obviously working very hard,
Well, I write, I write every day, and have Joel McDermott, who's really taken over the reins at American Vision. He was a little younger, and that was the whole plan, is to have somebody who had the same type of mindset to take over American Vision eventually, and that's what Joel's doing. So I'm spending most of my time speaking and writing these days.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I've got Joel coming on in a couple of weeks to talk about the whole biblical worldview when it comes to politics and that sort of issue. He sounds like he knows his stuff about on that particular issue, because that's an area obviously where there is some contention and confusion from the Christian worldview about how much we should get involved in politics and right there wrongly, because obviously we've got a situation at the minute where two candidates are neither you can make an argument are particularly Christian, but so we're going to have him on in a couple of weeks. But obviously you cover a wide range of topics yourself as well. But I came across you when it came to eschatology. I know your story, Gary. There are a couple of stories of my own, believe it or not. I had a Catholic background before I was converted. But I found it quite impressive, just for the audience's sake, just to give us a little bit of history about you and your studying of the scriptures, because you were really fast-tracked, weren't you? You went to Bible college and you sort of crammed in a lot of stuff in a very short period of time.
Well, most of I was raised Roman Catholic as well. I became a Christian in 1973. Most of my younger years were devoted to athletics. I was on a track and field scholarship in college to the shot put, discus, and javelin. And so sports was an area that I really had a keen interest in. When I became a Christian in 1973, when I was 23, there was a major change in direction. And I don't know how old you are or how old most of your listeners are, but in the 1970s, there was a huge...
Just to give you an idea, I'm 40.
Okay. Well, you're in terms of the 1970s, you're let's see, 30, 40, well, you weren't even born then when Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth came out.
No, I wasn't.
Yeah. So that book sold tens of millions of copies, and Christians all over the world were preparing for some type of eschatological prophetic end before the end of the 1980s, basically 1988. And I think it had a huge impact on Christians in the area of worldview issues, and particularly politics. And that's really how I got into the eschatology thing, is because as I went out and spoke on worldview issues, a lot of people would say, wait a minute, the Bible says Jesus is coming back soon. This is the terminal generation. We're living in the last days. Israel became a nation again in 1948. Generation is 40 years. 40 plus 1948 is 1988. And I just saw that it had a huge impact on people's forward thinking and things beyond their personal Christian life.
Yeah, because let me just give you. I understand exactly where that's coming from, because I became a Christian pretty much 2 years ago today. As I say, I was brought up Catholic. I was convinced that Jesus Christ was God. I did some research, and the foundations were laid by a couple of people, I think, and then the actual supernatural element of being born again occurred. And up to that point, it's quite strange, actually, because when I first read Matthew 24, Gary, in my early Christian days, and when I was starting to look at all this stuff, I looked at Matthew 24 and I said, why is it that people think this is talking about a future generation 2,000 years hence? And I put it away because I thought, well, obviously there are people who know a lot more about the Bible than I do, and I'm just going to go along with what they think. And about 18 months later, when I had studied the Bible a little bit more myself and maybe had a little bit more confidence, I don't know, I looked at it again and I thought, I'm sorry, but I just, this doesn't seem right to me. Jesus does not seem to be talking about a generation here 2,000 years in the future. And I actually went online and looked up and I typed it in, Matthew 24, past, present, or future, whatever. And I actually came across another guy, a guy called Steve Gregg, who'd done a lot of work in this whole area, talking about whether dispensationalism was true or not. And around the same time, I came across yourself, and he actually preached the gospel online, which got me converted. And up to that point, I didn't know any other view. I just thought that dispensationalism and premillennialism was the only party in town, really,
Well, I think that's most people today. When I go out and I speak, where I used to do interviews, back in the 80s and the 90s on this topic, people would call in and say they didn't realize there was another view. And They were always kind of uneasy about all the prophetic speculation, but they didn't know where to go because almost all the radio shows, all the the Christian television, most of the books in the bookstore were end time books. And so when someone came on the radio and said, "Well, no, wait a minute, this generation, every time it's used in the New Testament, refers to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking," I got several reactions. One was very, very, very negative, that I didn't believe the Bible and I wasn't even a Christian. Others who said they never heard this view, and others who said, "Well, I need to do a little more research on all this." So there's been a huge shift in eschatology since the 1980s, and people are once again looking at these prophetic passages in terms of being fulfilled in the generation to whom Jesus spoke. And you mentioned Steve Gregg, and he's got this wonderful book on the Book of Revelation, giving the four basic views of the Book of Revelation in parallel columns.
Yeah.
And that's what we need. We need people to kind of. I just got back from a conference. I was speaking up in Tennessee, and did a 2-day conference on eschatology, mostly related to Matthew 24. So there, since when I started this back in the 1980s till today, I've seen a tremendous amount of material that has come out on eschatology related to the past fulfillment of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21.
Yes, indeed. And as you well know, I've spoken to people about it. I've had the same reaction. I've had people telling me that I need to go away and research my Bible, that I don't understand the scriptures, that I'm not a Christian, and I need to blindly support Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And it's frustrating because you think, not only do you not realize that there are other views out there, but you're talking about other views in amillennialism and postmillennialism, which have been held as the main views and the forefront in church history, and that actually dispensationalism is actually an aberrant theology in church history, which has only been around maybe 150 years. It came out with the Schofield Reference Bible and John Nelson Darby and people like this.
Yeah.
So I mean, it is quite frustrating. I don't know how many. I've had. The strange thing is, actually, when I came off the idea of dispensationalism, I wasn't in it for too long, because I wasn't into any particular system too long, because I moved quite quickly and into the amillennial position because it made a lot more biblical sense to me. But actually, to be honest, Gary, the whole issue of eschatology became somewhat of something that I kind of lost a little bit of interest in. Now that I wasn't looking out to see, looking at the geopolitical landscape, looking out to see if I could identify the Antichrist,
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I think a lot of people are very provincial. The only thing that counts historically is what's happening to them at their particular period of time. They have no sense of history, and so when you go back, there's a book I have by Oswald J. Smith, who wrote a book in 1927 about who the Antichrist was, and he pointed out that it was Mussolini. He took all the scriptures that he thought related to the Antichrist, and he says Mussolini is the guy. And of course, until Mussolini was executed, and then of course Hitler was the big bad guy, Gorbachev, Napoleon, all the way through history, and you'll find the same Bible verses being used with to prove that at that particular time period they were living in the last days. And I always thought that the Bible can't be that confusing. And if it is, I wouldn't want to. I couldn't be a Christian. I couldn't believe the Bible if generation after generation, the same Bible verses are being used to predict the end of the world with some new Antichrist figure. It couldn't be that way. And so, when I was in seminary, I came across a little book that was sitting on our librarian's used bookshelf. He was selling his books, and it was just, the title of it was simply Matthew 24, and it was written by Marcellus Kick, K-I-K. He had originally published it in 1948 by Bible Depot, and then it came out again. A Presbyterian Reformed Publishing Company published it in a new edition, and I read it, and I was really blown away by that, because what Kick did was simply compared Scripture with Scripture. he says, look, this is what Jesus says here. Let's look at other places in Scripture where the same type of wording or phraseology is used. And he said every time the phrase "this generation" is used in the New Testament, it always refers, without exception, to the generation of Jesus' day, which anybody reading it for the first time, as you did, you come to that conclusion. But then you find people say, well, it can't mean that because it says the greatest tribulation, the gospel will be preached in all the world, Jesus is coming on the clouds of heaven, the sun, moon, and stars, go dark and they fall. That since those things didn't happen, therefore Jesus must have meant, well, this race of people or the generation that sees these signs, which is typically future. But when I've taken people through this verse by verse, they begin to see it. I never saw that before. I never saw that verse before. I never saw that argument before. So it does take someone to kind of, re-image their mindset because they've heard for so long that all of these passages have to refer to some distant future generation.
That is the problem because, as I say, I only had known that one view because, as I say, as you know, this transcends into the popular culture, and transcends Christianity. And I just went to the passage assuming that it was about our time. And I'm sorry, but when I looked at it, particularly in the context, I thought, what is the problem here? Jesus is talking about a particular event, this beautiful building, and it's all going to come crashing down. And they say, when shall these things come to pass? And can you give us a sign? And I really can't, I hadn't been so indoctrinated by it that I couldn't step out of it and think for myself. But I can sympathize if you had maybe, I became a Christian later. If you were a Christian for 20 or 25 years, brought up that way, believing that, you would just simply impose your view onto the Scripture, and I suppose do a bit of an eisegesis job on it. And but it seemed perfectly, I really was sort of confused about it, because I thought, is there anybody else out there who agrees with me that Matthew 24 is talking about, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and this generation shall not pass? And I thought, well, unless that generation are somewhere in hiding, and they're living for 2,000 years, this just doesn't make any sense to me,
Well, yeah, but you have to remember the mindset here. You have the Schofield Reference Bible, which came out in the first decade of the 20th century. All these notes at the bottom of the page, and that became kind of your in-house interpreter of what the Bible had to say. Who are you going to how can you dispute? How can a new Christian dispute with a guy who has all these notes in the Bible? It's a hard thing to do. And then the second thing is the excitement factor. Here's somebody telling us what's going to take place in our future. That's exciting, and people got excited about it, and a lot of people became Christians as a result of that. They saw that the end was coming very, very soon, and so they needed to repent and believe in Jesus and so forth. But the thing is, a lot of liberals, went to Matthew chapter 24 and said, look, Jesus was mistaken. He didn't return in that generation. And Bart Ehrman, who's a skeptic of some sort,
a liberal scholar, I would say, isn't he?
Yeah. He teaches at North Carolina, and he started out with that, with the Hal Lindsey and the Tim LaHaye stuff, and one of his professors simply said to him, he says, "What if they're wrong?" And so it was the eschatological aspect of the Bible that made Bart Ehrman take a second look at things and says, look, the Bible has mistakes in it. Well, the Bible doesn't have mistakes in it. I have a good friend, Douglas Wilson, who debated Christopher Hitchens a few years ago. I was one of the producers on it, and it's simply called Collision. It's available on Amazon. And there's a segment in there where the two of them are at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Christopher Hitchens brings up the liberal line about Jesus was mistaken in in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. And Doug Wilson gave probably a 1 minute to a minute and a half explanation of Matthew 24. And basically Christopher Hitchens didn't have a response because he had never heard that argument before. And he's a guy who knew his Bible better than most. but he had not heard that argument, and there was no way to refute it. If a dispensationalist had been debating Christopher Hitchens and that issue came up, a dispensationalist would have had to gone through all sorts of maneuvering and pulling here and pulling there in order to make that passage work. Doug Wilson just said, hey, this generation means this. This language here is typical of the Old Testament language of judgment. Jesus was referring to that generation. Nothing very significant about it. The event took place before that generation passed away. Let's move on to the next question. And that was pretty much the end of the discussion.
Yeah, and I found it fascinating when I did realize that, because then you can, all this marries up with, the historical, sort of secular writings of people like Josephus and things like that. And when you look at Josephus's writings and you look at some of the, the language in Revelation, it's really fascinating. And as I say, Gary, I lost interest in a lot of it because I thought, okay, time to get on with the business of trying to follow Jesus Christ rather than trying to identify who the Antichrist is and where I'm going to be and how I'm going to survive the Great Tribulation,
Right. Yeah. I mean, and then another thing, again, we're the second aspect of being provincial in our thinking. There are people around the world today are going through horrible, horrible tribulation, being killed for their faith, and they're not escaping the tribulation. We see, what's happening in parts of Africa and even in Europe and so forth. So, we're so focused on our own little world that we forget there are Christians suffering around the world, and there's no escape through a rapture.
Okay, all right. Listen, we'll come back on the other side, and we'll get down into some of the more detailed elements of all this.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We've got to stop them! They're going to kill us all!
See how the trouble you've started?
Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it.
Right, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio.
That would be me, Wild Bill Samsel, your host of the Samsel Report. Join me for Wild Bill's Headline Roundup every Saturday night right here on Revolution Radio.
There is no good and evil. There is only power, and those too weak to seek it.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Be sure to tune in weekdays 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Strange Universe with Sean David Morton. A strange, interesting, and engaging wide variety of topics. So be here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Gary, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we're back live, Gary. Yeah, I recently saw just on this whole topic. I saw a video by Jack Hibbs, Mark Hitchcock, and Paul Wilkinson. Probably names you're familiar with.
Yes.
And they described anyone who doesn't concur with the dispensationalism in pretty strong terms at times. Satanic deception, one of the terms that was used for people, for people who don't believe in their view of things, and of course the term replacement theology. Anytime I hear it, it seems to be a pejorative, really. And we have this whole issue. I mean, how did it become so popular to the point where we've had 2,000 years almost of amillennialism, postmillennialism, non-dispensational premillennialism, and then we have this absolute sort of saturation of this theology?
Well, the first thing I would say is if their indictment of anybody who doesn't hold to the dispensational view is involved in the deception, the satanic deception, that means anybody any Christian before 1830 would be involved in a deception, because dispensationalism didn't arise until the 1830s and didn't become really popular until the beginning of the 20th century. So for almost 1900 years, right, 1800 years, the whole church was deceived about eschatology. So, that's nonsense, and it shows the desperation, because these guys really cannot answer the objections that have been raised against dispensationalism. They basically quote themselves in their books. They rarely quote outside sources, and trying to get a debate with a lot of these guys is very, very difficult. Now, Tommy Ice has debated me quite a few times, and the late Dave Hunt did as well. Mark Hitchcock did debate Hank Hanegraaff on the dating of the Book of Revelation. I don't think Hank Hanegraaff did a very good job. Ken Gentry was the guy who's really the expert on that. But I mean, it's just not. You just can't make a case for dispensationalism. You just cannot do it. Many of the things they maintain are not found in the New Testament. I'll give you an example. New Testament doesn't say anything about a rebuilt temple. It doesn't say anything about Israel becoming back to the land again, or having anything significant, or coming back to the land as anything prophetically significant. There's not a single verse in the New Testament that says the church will be taken off the earth before a 7-year tribulation period. So all the basic features of dispensationalism, there are no individual verses in the New Testament that support those foundation stones of the position. And they'll try to get around all that, but it seems to me that if you can't find a verse that says that the church is going to be raptured prior to a 7-year tribulation period, which is fundamental to their position, that position is just, it's built on sand.
Yes, exactly. I mean, as I say, I've kind of, not focused so much on it over the last couple of years, but, from my knowledge of it, we're talking about Old Testament prophecies in Daniel and other books, obviously, that were fulfilled, which the dispensationalists just seem to have, they seem to bypass chronology in many cases, because a lot of these prophecies have yet to be fulfilled. As you quite rightly pointed out, you can go through the New Testament with a fine-tooth comb, and you won't find a single prophecy or a single mention about the Jews being returned to that land. And you would think, if that was going to be the case, someone would have mentioned it somewhere, but there isn't actually one. So then what you get is, I had some guy, they're very dogmatic, a lot of them, who's talking to me, sent me, 10 prophecies fulfilled in 1948. Amos 9:14, Ezekiel 37:10, Isaiah 66:7, on and on, Ezekiel 37:21, Jeremiah 16:14, etc., etc. All these Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled in 1948. It can be a difficult thing to deal with, I think, when you're talking about this, because they obviously have a different view, so.
Yeah, those passages, the Old Testament does predict that a temple is going to be rebuilt. The Old Testament does predict that the Jews are going to return to their land, or Israel is going to return to their land. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Israel goes into captivity. Well, the southern kingdom goes into captivity under the Babylonians, and the northern 10 tribes go into captivity under the Assyrians. There's the 70 years that they're in captivity. Jeremiah is told that they're going to return to back to their land. Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, is essentially reviewing the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah, there's a prophecy in there that they will return after 70 years. That 70 years is about to come to an end. He's probably an old man by now. He was brought into the Babylonian captivity. So the Old Testament does, in fact, predict that the temple was going to be rebuilt and Israel will return to the land. So all the passages from the Old Testament that talk about Israel returning to the land had, in fact, been fulfilled. And when you get to the New Testament, what do you find? The temple is rebuilt and the Jews are in their land, just like the Old Testament prophesied. So in order to come up with passages, in order to come up with a prophetic system that says the temple is going to be rebuilt again and that the Jews are going to return to their land again, you would have to find that in the New Testament, and the New Testament doesn't have any of that. They go to the most obscure passage in Matthew chapter 24, the verse 32 about the parable of the fig tree, and they say, "Aha, there it is." That's when the Israel is the fig tree, even though Israel is the olive tree in Romans 11. But okay, let's assume that Israel is the fig tree in Matthew chapter 24, and it only produces leaves on that tree. And you go back 3 chapters to Matthew chapter 21, Jesus comes across a fig tree. There's only leaves on the tree. He curses the fig tree, and he says, "There'll never be fruit from you again." And that's why there are a lot of Mark Hitchcock included, and John Walvoord and others who say, no. Israel is not the fig tree, because we've pointed out to them if Israel is the fig tree in Matthew chapter 24, then Israel is the fig tree in Matthew chapter 21. And Matthew chapter 1 says a leaves-only tree is not going to have any fruit on it again. So they've changed their view on the fig tree, because we've pointed out to them the illustration from Matthew chapter 21 says there's never going to be fruit on the tree. Now, that doesn't mean that Jews can't come to Christ, but as a national covenantal entity, that has been fulfilled. Their job was done when Jesus came into the world and did his redemptive work and rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. That's what Israel was all about. It wasn't to go on to a perpetual old covenant type religion. It was, we're now in the new covenant, as the book of Hebrews spells out in great detail.
Yeah, it's almost very strange because, when I talk to the dispensationalists, it's almost like they read the scriptures like the rabbis did, and Paul, of course, said they have a veil over their eyes, and it seems like it's a return to almost rabbinical thinking about end times, and I find it concerning myself because I think it crosses over into politics. There's blind support of Israel. I've heard some of those guys I mentioned to you, they've also been throwing, and other followers of, of dispensationalism are very quick to throw out the anti-Semitism term as well. And again, it's, it really, I don't really understand it. I sometimes wonder whether, some of these people are actually converted, that they don't seem to be able to see it with any spiritual eyes. And I don't mean that in a nasty way, but it just seems very plain to me. Obviously, the Lord didn't come to, set up a literal kingdom, but we have Christians who are sending money to try and rebuild the temple.
Yeah, and I debated Michael Brown, who's a Jewish Christian, and we share a lot of things on the political and the cultural and the ethical side of things, but on eschatology, he and I differ. But he's not a dispensationalist, although he is a premillennialist. And I said, Dr. Brown, I said, here's the problem I have with your view about Israel in the future. Is you believe there's going to be a time when Israel is going to be reconstituted in the land and so forth and so on. And I said, how do you deal with Zechariah chapter 13 verse 8? Because Zechariah 13 verse 8 says that 2/3 of the Jews are going to be slaughtered, are going to be killed. And I quoted for him probably 5 or 6. I have more quotations from dispensational writers. Charles Ryrie, who wrote the notes for the Ryrie Study Bible, said it's going to be Israel's greatest bloodbath. Jack Van Impe, Walter Kaiser, John Walver, all of these guys I quoted about what happens to Israel after the rapture. 2/3 of them are going to be slaughtered. And I said, why? So what's your answer to that? Well, he didn't have an answer to it. It's like he had never thought about it before. And he talks, he was critical of this so-called replacement theology. And I said, look, you're the guys who have a hellish new Holocaust for Israel in the future based upon your eschatology, based upon your reading of Zechariah 13.8, chapter 13, verse 8. That's your position. And so replacement theology, you can blast it all you want, and I gave a good answer for it and explained why he misunderstands it, and most people do because they don't really want to tell the truth about all this. I said, your problem is with your own system, because you believe that Jews are going to be slaughtered again. And again, he didn't have an answer for that. And that anytime I talk to a dispensationalist about Israel in the future, I always ask them, I said, well, how do you deal with Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8? And most of them have never thought about it before. But if you read the dispensational literature, it's their view that in the future, after the rapture of the church, God's going to start dealing with Israel again, and 2/3 of the Jews living in Israel are going to be slaughtered. It'll be another Holocaust.
Yeah.
So they're the ones. Yeah. Go ahead.
It's when you do look at it in any kind of detail, it is the strangest relationship. You have a state over there which is, not remotely Christian, hostile to it in some cases. There seems to be a complete and utter blackout in the U.S. media about anything negative about Israel. I'm not a fan of the state. I'll tell you that up front. But I'm not going to get into the whole political side of it. But on the other side, then you have Christians, as you quite rightly say, under the system. Christians get raptured out. And then God gets down to dealing with the real business of Israel. But, before that happens, you have the Antichrist setting up residence in the temple in Israel, in Jerusalem, and there's 2/3 of them get slaughtered, the biggest bloodbath of ever. Yeah. It's the strangest kind of relationship because, I actually heard a Jew from Israel who looked at this properly and understood the Christian view of it, and he was outraged. And I thought, well, that is a normal reaction. And equally, I think, if Christians knew really what the majority of people in Israel thought of Christianity, there would be some outrage too. But it really is a strange thing, as you just said. It actually results in an absolute bloodbath for Jews.
Yeah, and the thing of this is you mentioned a Jewish man who understood all this. Well, there was I think it was last year, it may have been 2 years ago, where somebody in the Democratic Party, which is very, very liberal, I wouldn't say anti-Christian, but not very Christian, and they were interviewing this man, this Jew, and he was saying, look, this Christianity, they believe that in the future, we're going to be slaughtered and on and on and on and on. And he was absolutely right. That is the position. The Jews in the future, according to their view, will be slaughtered under the reign of the Antichrist. And there's another example of not one thing in the New Testament that says anything about the Antichrist, making a covenant with Israel, breaking the covenant in the middle of the 7 week in the 7 years, building this temple, slaughtering the Jews, and all that. It's all fabricated from Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. In order to get that view, they have to put a gap of nearly 2,000 years between the 69th week of Daniel and the 70th week of Daniel in order to make their system work. It is a bizarre system, and I have an idea that the more complicated something is for some Christians, the more believable it is. It's not like they deny Occam's razor. Look for the simplest solution. But if you can make something complicated, it takes more faith to believe it. Therefore, they end up believing it because it's more complicated. I come out and say, well, this generation refers to the generation of Jesus speaking. All these things took place before that generation passed away. That's it. And that's it. It's not any more complicated than that? No.
Yeah.
So, you're right. There is this strange relationship. And I also say one more thing to them. I said, look, based upon Zechariah 13:8, which is a centerpiece of their system, it seems to me, instead of you raising money, I think there's an organization called On Wings of Eagles where they raise money to bring Jews from persecution in, say, Russia and so forth, and they fly them to Israel. And I said, do you realize that for every 3 Jews that you've raised money for to take to Jerusalem, to take to Israel, according to Zechariah 13:8, 2 of them are going to be slaughtered. It seems to me, if you really believed your system, you would in fact be getting Jews out of Israel rather than getting them into Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, yeah.
John Hagee, they've missed out a little bit in the slogan at the end: Christians United for Israel, and the next biggest Holocaust ever for you lot.
Yeah, that's the system. I don't think he ever tells anybody that that's going to happen, but maybe he does. But it won't matter. It won't matter to Christians, because Christians are going to be, they'll be raptured and they won't be here. It's a very convenient system, because there's no way empirically to determine whether or not anything they're saying is true, because Christians won't be around and because of the rapture to test anything that they say, which gives them the advantage, because any prophecy that they claim hasn't been fulfilled yet, they say, oh, that takes place after the rapture. That takes place after the rapture. And you can't deal with it empirically, where anytime I propose that a prophecy has been fulfilled, I of course have to prove it empirically. I have to show that it has been fulfilled. So the burden of proof is on me. The burden of proof is never on them, because they always say it's in the future, it's going to happen after the rapture, and we won't be around here to know, so et cetera, et cetera.
It's genius. Steve, the other implication, and you alluded to it earlier, Steve Gregg, I've heard him talking about this, when he was being a Bible teacher in the 70s and, the Jesus movement and all that, he said that, because of books like Hal Lindsey and everything else, there was a whole bunch of Christians that, they were waiting for the rapture and everything else. And then 5 years passed, and he said, maybe 10% of them dropped off. And then 10 years passed, and still nothing happened. And a lot of these people lost their apparent faith. I would question whether a lot of them were, converted in the first place. Because, the way I look at it is, it doesn't really even matter. If you get your eschatology wrong, if you're following Christ and living the correct Christian life, what does it matter? But there seems to be so much, no, you got to know, you got to keep your eye out, you got to know when the rapture, or, when this is all going to go down. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm living for Christ and I'm doing the right thing and it all happens, well, what difference is it going to make? And as you quite rightly said, it might not be the great tribulation, which is so provincial that they're all waiting for, but you've got Christians all over the world at the minute are coming under tremendous persecution. And while we talk about the dire state of the church in the West, you also have places like in the Philippines and China and South America where there's tremendous growth and there's tremendous conversions going on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, here's another thing that a lot of people who are dispensationalists don't know about their own system. If you go back and read some of the older dispensationalists, they say there are no prophetic events prior to the rapture, because we're living in a parenthesis. Where the prophetic time clock stopped when the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and the prophetic clock won't start back up again until the rapture. That means we are in a period of time, according to dispensationalists, that was never predicted anywhere in the Bible. So when someone points to wars or rumors of wars or tribulation or Israel becoming a nation again, all those things are irrelevant given the basics of dispensationalism as it was taught before. And a lot of Christians are not aware of this at all. Israel becoming a nation again can't be a fulfillment of Bible prophecy according to dispensationalism, because it takes place within this period of time that was never part of the biblical system. And so earthquakes and famines and all that kind of stuff, again, can't take place because the rapture, according to their position, the rapture could take place at any moment, which means it could have taken place before Israel became a nation again in 1948. It could have taken place in the 1500s and the 1400s and the 1300s. The rapture, they say, is always imminent. It could take place at any time. But you can't sell prophecy books if you're not predicting the future. That's why books like mine don't sell as well, because they don't make any predictions about the future. But you couldn't really sell dispensational premillennialism today, because you can't look at signs anywhere, because there are no signs prior to the rapture of the church, according to their view.
Yeah, I just don't know how long they're going to be able to get away with extending this generation. Just for our listeners who may not be as familiar with it, Israel became a nation again in 1948. Hal Lindsey looked at a generation biblically correctly, I believe, to say 40 years, had to allow 7 years for the Great Tribulation and the first 3.5 years of that part. So then he basically said that in 1981 we would get the tribulation going in earnest, and then in about 1988 we would have the end of the world. That didn't happen. He said, I'll either be a hero or a bomb. Obviously, he's a bomb according to himself. But we now, Gary, have almost 2 biblical generations. Am I correct in thinking a generation biblically is 40 years, and also there doesn't seem to be any hermeneutical basis for this gap between the 69th and 70th week of Daniel. There's no other prophecies that were ever interpreted that way. So I just don't know how this has got so much traction.
Yeah, I've looked at every time the Bible talks about a certain number of days or months or years. There's never a gap. The only place that I've seen that there is a gap, that the dispensationalists say there's a gap, is in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. But there can't be, because when you look at when you read Daniel 9, the beginning of Daniel 9, Daniel is reading Jeremiah, and it's the 70 years of captivity. And then you get this 70 weeks of years. And you would think that the two would correlate, 70 years of captivity, 70 weeks of years. just imagine if Israel were in captivity, and near the end of the 69th year, they're anticipating that one more year to go, and they're going to be released from the captivity and return to their land and so forth. Well, the 70th year comes, 70th year passes, and they say, well, maybe we miscalculated the 72nd year, Finally, one of the prophets, goes to God and says, God, what's the deal here? You said 70 years. Oh, I didn't tell you, but there's a gap in time between the 69th year and the 70th year. And so I'm not counting that time. And so you'll only be in captivity for 70 years, but I won't count the gap. And that's ridiculous. And you get to Daniel, it says 70 years. It says 70 years, and I think the verb there is actually singular. And in fact, there's an interesting passage in the New Testament. I haven't worked this out yet, but remember that Jesus is talking about forgiveness, and the disciples ask, how many times should we forgive? And Jesus says 70 times 70, 490.
In Luke 21.
And I believe. Pardon?
I think it's Luke 21. I think, if I'm correct, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. I don't think so. Luke 21 is the Olivet Discourse, but 400. It's interesting. 70 times 7, 490 times. And I really do believe that Jesus was using that based upon Daniel 9, bringing them all the way up to his time period, because that's the 490 years, the 490 times is about to run out. You take that literally, that's exactly what happened, because Jesus gives one final generation, gives them 40 years to repent, and finally no repentance. Temple's destroyed. Their city is sacked by the Romans. 1 million Jews are said to have died. 50,000 of them taken into captivity. It's a done deal. Israel's judgment is over. If you're a dispensationalist, you're still looking for another judgment to come upon Israel in the form of according to Charles Ryrie, the greatest bloodbath in Israel's history. The simpler solution is Israel's judgment is over. Israel's like any other nation today. They are to follow the same moral guidelines and directives as us here in the United States, you in Great Britain, no matter what nation is. Israel's under the same umbrella of moral obligation. And we should treat them that way. We should be as just with them as we are with any other nation. We don't have two different, weights to evaluate. If Israel does something wrong, they need to be condemned for it. If Israel does something well, they should be praised for it like any other nation.
Yes, exactly. That passage you were talking about, by the way, it's an interesting one. It's in Luke 17, I meant to say, excuse me, if your brother sins against you, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him 7 times in the day, and then 70 times 70. Luke 17, 3 and 4. Yes, exactly, because...
let me just tell you, that's interesting, because that same chapter, if that's Luke 17, that same chapter, you'll see kind of a mini Olivet Discourse in there. If you read later in the chapter, you'll see a very short Olivet Discourse where some of the same things are happening. I'm going to have to take a look at that. But anyway, that was something I kind of came up with. I'm not saying that that's exactly what Jesus was saying there, but I think it's very important to keep that in mind when you see numbers are being the same.
Okay, I'll see you on the other side, about 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
When a knock post-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week. Yes. But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting. Yes, I see. By a simple majority in the case of purely internal affairs. Be quiet. But by a 2/3 majority in the case of more... Be quiet. I order you to be quiet. Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left. Yes, I have. Look! It's just a flesh wound.
I don't believe I've seen such a display of courage, skill, nerve, grace, and stupidity.
I'll do you for that. Oh, what? Come here. What are you going to do, bleed on me? I'm invincible. You're a loony. The Black Knight's always triumph.
Roundtable Live, Monday through Friday, 1 a.m. till 4 a.m. Eastern Time. Bring your mind, bring your ideas, bring your voice. King Arthur had nothing on us here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com.
Enjoy your
extra big-ass fries.
You didn't give me no fries. I got an empty box.
Would you like another?
Extra big-ass fries.
I said I didn't get any.
Thank you. Your account has been charged. Your balance is 0. Please come back when you can afford to make a purchase.
No.
I'm sorry you're having
trouble.
trouble.
Come on. My kids are starving.
Thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we believe in freedom of ideas, freedom of speech, but above all, we believe in freedom of existence through self-reliance. This station is 100% listener-supported, and as a fundraising promotion, I have a kick-ass free gift for a $100 donation. 35,000 seeds. 25 years in the freezer. Long-term storable, 54 different varieties. So if food prices go crazy, the shit hits the fan, or if you just want to save tons of money every year by creating your own food like I do, grab our seed pack special. Just look for the banner on the homepage at freedomslips.com. Don't be a statistic. Don't be part of the problem. Be part of the solution. We need, as humans, to start taking care of ourselves and not depending on the megacorps to provide unhealthy, nasty food. Included in this package is also a DVD with 900 survival and off-grid living documents and the offline home canning, how to do everything website, all on the DVD. So when you're growing all that food, you know how to can it, store it, preserve it, etc. with all these documents. So thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I hope that you will pick up this package and start learning to be free. Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps and freedom is one seed that needs to be planted.
What are we doing live? It goes in eternity.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hi, you're back with me, Paul Stevenson, here on the Revelation Show on Revolution Radio, and I'm with Gary Demar, who we're discussing eschatology, which is the study of end times, biblical end times. And you there, Gary?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, you know, as I say, I've kind of I have lost interest in this sort of stuff a little bit. You know, when I came out of it myself, I wasn't in it for that long because I wasn't into anything that long before I became a Christian. But it was, you know, so it wasn't that difficult for me to sort of shackle it off. But I actually find it a lot more interesting. You know, when I looked at the more, you know, the amillennial view and these things and the preterist. I mean, I've even at times wondered, you know, if, you know, at times I'm a little bit ambivalent about, you know, maybe even being a full preterist. I don't know, but you know, certainly I'm a partial preterist, and it just seems to make a lot more sense to me. You know, all around historically, even when you look at the secular writings about the destruction in AD 70 and everything else. I also wanted to say, we mentioned Steve Gregg earlier. I know that Steve, you were quite influential on Steve, actually, because I heard him saying in one of his lectures, because he was a dispensationalist himself for a good while, which is why he knows the system inside out. He now teaches against it, and has the same view as yourself. But I noticed he did mention you in one of his lectures, that you were quite influential on his thinking and all this, and helped him in that way as well. So it's funny how things go around, And just for our listeners, do you want to give out the name of your website and your books, some of your books on this topic, Gary?
Well, the website is AmericanVision.org. AmericanVision.org. Some of the books related to prophecy, Last Days Madness is probably the most influential one. Is Jesus Coming Soon, which is a short exposition of Matthew chapter 24, similar to what Marcellus Kick did. I've got Prophecy Wars, which is a response to a debate I did with a historic premillennialist and an amillennialist on the book of Revelation, but there's other stuff in there as well. I've got Identifying the Last Days Scoffers, 10 Prophecy Myths Exposed and Answered, the Gog and Magog End Time Alliance, which is on Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Early Church and the End of the World, which deals with the early church and the claim that they were premillennial. And then I wrote a response that was published by Thomas Nelson called Left Behind, Separating Facts from Fiction.
Okay, yeah. Also, I meant to say there's a lot I want to talk to you about, but we're not going to have that much time. We're in the last half hour. Hopefully, we can get you back on again, Gary, at some point, and we can go through, stuff again. This is typical. For example, someone's I've just had a message. If you can provide me biblical evidence as well as historical fact to back up your claims against Israel, I am willing to listen. I have listened and watched the videos you provided. One of the videos that this guy had provided was your debate you did with Jim Fletcher. But I didn't see them able to explain away all the unfulfilled prophecies or a single Bible passage that states that God has forsaken Israel as his people. I listened to one debate with the late Dave Hunt and another opponent to the existence of Israel, and Dave Hunt asked him the same question. Where does it say in the Bible that we have replaced Israel as God's people and that he has forsaken them entirely? The guy tried to change the subject again and again, but couldn't come up with anything. The fact is, the Bible doesn't say any of that at all. But if that is to be believed, then we have created a major theological problem. If God is so quick to abandon the Jews, that makes him a God who is not true to his word. So what stops him from abandoning us and leaving us without salvation if he is so quick to abandon Israel? Now, this is one of the things that they throw up all the time.
Yeah, and he's very easy to answer because he's asking he's positioning the question in the wrong way. I don't know anybody who believes that God has given up on Israel. God hasn't given up on anybody. It's not like, well, here's Israel over here and there's everybody else over here, and God doesn't want to have anything to do with Israel. There are lots of Jews today who are Christians. I mentioned Dr. Michael Brown and Steve Schlissel, both friends, committed Christians, but raised in Jewish families. There are Christians being saved every day all around the world. But let's understand this replacement theology thing. Nothing replaced Israel in the New Testament. Who were the first believers in Jesus as the promised Messiah? They were Jews.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at Acts chapter 2 verse 5, it says there were Jews living in Jews living in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven. Who were the first converts? They were Jews. Who made up the first church in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 5? Jews. When the great persecution came, Acts chapter 8, who made up the church in Jerusalem? Jews. The Bible says to the Jew first. So Israel wasn't replaced by anything. The understanding of the word church, people think, oh, the church is something new. The church isn't. The word church, if you were to go and look at the Old Testament, mostly written in Hebrew, you would come across the word kahal. When it was translated into Greek, it was the word kahal was translated as ecclesia. And if you go into the New Testament, which was written in Greek, and pick up a Hebrew Bible, you will see that a Hebrew translation of the Greek translates ecclesia as kahal. So in Hebrew and in Greek, kahal and ecclesia are the same words. They mean the same thing. The church isn't anything new. In fact, if you go back to Tyndale did not want to use the word church. He wanted to use the word congregation or assembly. Because the word church is ecclesia, they translated it more as an ecclesiastical word. But all the word ecclesia means is congregation or assembly. So go back to the New Testament, and instead of reading the word church, when you see the word church written in English, read assembly or a congregation. There isn't anything new in the New Testament regarding the church. So the first Christians, the first people who belonged to the first ecclesia, were all Jews. What's different about the New Testament over against the Old Testament is that Gentiles, the nations, were grafted into an already existing Jewish assembly of believers. Now, again, when I debated Michael Brown, I brought up all of this, and he said, well, Gary, I agree with all that. But yet he wrote an article about how dangerous replacement theology was. And of course, in my talk, in my opening remarks, I said, there isn't any such thing as replacement theology. Nothing's being replaced. What's happening is something is being added to, and that was the non-Jews were being added to the already existing assembly congregation of believers that the New Testament, in fact, demonstrates in terms of Christians. So the questioner is creating a fiction as to what the real issue is. Nothing is being replaced. This was a made up. You had said it's a pejorative term, and that's exactly what it is. It's kind of like in politics when someone plays the race card. When you're losing the argument, play the race card. You just or play the woman card, whatever it might be. And in dispensational theology, they play the replacement card. It's, you believe in replacement theology. And when you ask them to define all that, you get, well, you believe the church replaced the Jews. And I said, or replaced Israel. I said, how can you say that when the first Christians were in fact Jews? And the first makeup of the church was in fact made up of Jews. But see, most people are, I hate to use the word of this, but it's accurate. They're ignorant. They really don't know their own system.
Well, it's either ignorance or it's something a bit more sinister. But those of us who, recognize the replacement theology as a pejorative, we would prefer to call that remnant theology or fulfillment theology or supersessionism. These terms would be more, we would sort of, attribute to what we see this being. As you say, it's not replacing anything, and it's ecclesia is the same term used for Israel and the congregation in the Old Testament as the church, and in the New Testament there's nothing going on here. And then we have Paul who's saying basically, in Romans 9, is it? Well, the other frustration I find, Paul addressed this issue. You need to understand that it's not that God's promises, and to this guy talking about is God abandoned people. Paul addresses it directly and says no. In Romans 9, is it 9:6?
Right. It's 11. It's chapter 11 where he goes through this exposition of. I'll get the wording exactly here, but what's interesting about that.
Not all of Israel. You need to understand that not all of Israel are Israel. In other words, making a distinction between the Israel of God and the ethnic national Israel, because otherwise we have a racist God who has the gospel for everybody else, but he's got a special carnal sort of situation going on for the nation of Israel.
Yeah, and see, this is interesting. Romans 11, verse 1. Everybody goes down to, all Israel will be saved. Later in the chapter, and they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. And Paul says, in this way, all Israel will be saved. But that's the middle of the chapter. You need to go back up to the very beginning of the chapter and how Paul argues his argument. He says, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So there you go. Paul says God has not rejected it. Now, he's not talking about something that's in the distant future. He's talking about something that was going on in his own day, because he says, I'm a descendant of Abraham, and I'm a Christian. So then he goes on, or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed the prophets, they have torn down the altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, then, Paul writes, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. And so Paul is saying all the promises that were made to Israel had in fact been given to Israel. The issue here is the remnant is the beneficiary of those promises. And when you read the book of Acts, you'll see 5,000 came to Christ, 3,000 came to Christ. There's a section there that says where the priests came to Christ. And so God did in fact fulfill all the promises made to Israel. So there isn't anything to replace. Here you have Peter in the book of Acts. It's interesting. He's in Joppa when this happens. He's supposed to go to the Gentiles, and he doesn't want to go to the Gentiles. And see, Joppa is the same place where Jonah was, and he didn't want to go to the Ninevites. And so Peter, Simon Bar Jonah, the son of Jonah, was very much like Jonah until God finally said, here, he saw this sheet come down out of heaven with unclean animals on it, and tells Peter, take, kill, and eat. Peter says, I've never eaten any unclean thing. God says, don't call unclean what I call clean. And the gospel goes to the Gentiles. These Gentiles are then grafted into an already existing Jewish body of believers that was called the ecclesia in Acts chapter 5 and Acts chapter 8. The word ecclesia, and you can go to Acts chapter 7, and it talks about the ecclesia that was in the wilderness. The church, you want to translate it the way it's translated, the church that's in the wilderness. That's the way the King James translates it. So, go ahead. Sorry, Guy, go ahead, sir. Well, I was just saying that the person who wrote this, doesn't understand the argument. And again, I keep pointing out that, and I asked Michael Brown this. I said, okay, Dr. Brown, tell me when all these promises to Israel are supposed to be fulfilled. It's not now, right? Does it take place during the tribulation period? Well, it can't take place during the tribulation period because according to your system, 2/3 of the Jews living in Israel are going to be slaughtered. How is God fulfilling his promises then? So when do all these promises take place? And again, the dispensationalist says, well, it's going to take place during the 1,000-year reign. I said, okay, let's go to Revelation chapter 20 and read Revelation chapter 20 and tell me where all the promises made to Israel are explained in Revelation chapter 20. It's nowhere to be found in Revelation chapter 20. And so there is no place in the future, biblically speaking, where a dispensationalist can look to see where these prophecies are going to be fulfilled.
Right, and I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I do think it's something which is, more popular in the U.S. Possibly, to the point of preoccupation, to the point of obsession, almost. I think, but even over here, it's very popular as well. I remember speaking to an elder, and they were raising money, I think, for missionaries going to Israel. And I said, well, why is this special funding going for missionaries to Israel? Why is Israel any more special than, say, Sweden or wherever? And he said, well, to the Jew first. The gospel goes to the Jew first. And I said, the gospel went to the Jew first, 2,000 years ago. Who was the early church? I mean, how can we have it gone to the Jew first when we've had 1,900 plus years of Gentiles? I mean, I'm sitting there, and he was an elder in the church as well. It was a Reformed church, actually. I was at, and it's so entrenched. And the other thing that I have found, Gary, and this is a frustration, possibly won't find this so much in the US, I think you're probably likely to be called an anti-Semite a lot quicker in the US. But over here, I've had people who keep your gospel. I'm not interested in the gospel. No, thank you. I'm not interested in your God who is behind Israel. Keep your Christian Zionism. No, thank you. I've had to overcome this because of the problem with the Israeli-Palestinian situation, where people think, well, if I'm going to become a Christian, I have to support Israel, do I? That's what the Bible says, according to you Christians. And come what may. And I struggled with it myself when I first became a Christian. It caused me a lot of angst. I was like, Jesus, do I have to support the state of Israel to follow you? I mean, and it was a bit of a dilemma. And I've come across this problem,
Yeah, I tell people, look, you support Israel when Israel does right, and you don't support Israel when Israel does wrong, and you do that with every nation. There's no special status anymore of any nation. And by the way, even in the Old Testament, there was a special status for Israel, but man, God judged Israel all the time. I mean, He sent them into captivity for a long, long time. We can't sit back when Israel does something wrong and just say, well, but they're God's chosen people. We can't say anything against it. That's nonsense. The Bible says we're supposed to judge with righteous judgment. Jesus was harder on His own people than he was on anyone else. And if you read the book of Acts, the antagonists in the book of Acts were the Jews. If you look at Acts chapter 21, there was a conspiracy among the Jews in order to kill Paul.
Yeah,
it was so bad.
They chased him.
Yeah, it was so bad that Paul had to appeal to Caesar in chapter 25. It was 23, by the way. Acts chapter 23. There was a conspiracy. In chapter 25, Paul appeals to Caesar. Pagan Rome. He appeals to pagan Rome to protect him over his own countrymen. That's a staggering thing.
Yeah, exactly. As I say, the more you look, I think a lot of it comes down to biblical illiteracy. I've also said to Christians, why have you got this soft spot for Israel, in your Christian thinking? Have you read the Old Testament? It's not exactly a great testimony apart from the remnant. It's just as you say, it's a rebellion. They're into all, the Israel in the Old Testament. They're up to their neck in idolatry and all sorts of wickedness, and they're judged. So, when you read it, it strikes you. When I read it, I just thought, before I read the Bible, I thought they were all, it was all really sort of plain sailing until I read it, and I thought, whoa, it's just some serious. How does God put up with this stuff? And that's not to say that, I'm being harsh on them, because obviously the church is probably just as guilty in many ways.
Oh, sure. Yeah, hey, here in the United States, we're having this election coming up here, and it's tearing the nation apart because there's been this moral decline, and it has been essentially codified, by law, by civil officials. And I understand Israel's got one of the largest pro-homosexual celebrations in Tel Aviv.
It's the gay capital of the world, with ostensibly, and again, it's a complete disconnect, because I don't see that many Christians sort of, wanting to support San Francisco, and Israel. Tel Aviv's even worse, and it's just, I don't know. I don't know I think it's just people like yourselves, Gary, and shows like this where we can cut through it. I do get the impression, that, put it this way, you do hear more and more people who used to be dispensationalists. I don't know any amillennialist, post-millennialist who says, I used to be one of those and I'm now a dispensationalist now that I've looked at the scriptures.
Yeah, I haven't heard anybody going back to dispensationalism. That's just, you can't do it, because I don't know anybody who's ever come to dispensationalism on their own. They've always come to dispensationalism by way of someone else's teaching, book, or whatever, but yet I've run into numerous people who have become preterists simply just by reading the Bible.
Yeah, and the other thing, I went through the Old Testament or the New Testament. If I'm correct, I went through it pretty, with a bit of a tooth comb with this. I think the Antichrist is only mentioned 4 times, and to my astonishment, 2 of them were plural. And I thought, how can you have a whole industry based around this stuff when you've got the term Antichrist, if I'm right, is mentioned 4 times only, and 2 of them are plural.
Yeah, I ask Christians and dispensationalists, I said, what book of the Bible does the word Antichrist appear more than any other book? And they usually say the book of Revelation. And I said, the word Antichrist doesn't appear anywhere in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, I know.
And my next question is, I said, what is I said, give me the biblical definition of Antichrist. They say, well, somebody who opposes Jesus or so forth. And I said, well, no, the actual definition of a biblical definition of Antichrist is someone who denies that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. I said, that's a religious designation. That is not a political designation. And then if you look at 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, he says, you've heard Antichrist has come. He says, there are many Antichrists. And then the next line tells you what period of time he's talking about. And he says, by this we know it is the last hour. And so he's not talking about something that was going to take place 2,000 years from his day. He was talking about something that was happening right then and there.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's even a guy, I don't know what you've heard of, Douglas Hemp. He wrote a book, writing a book about, how we've got the technology now, the Antichrist, we're going to, get a natural man and insert Satan's DNA into him and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I know. It gets... back in the 19th century, if you look at Daniel chapter 12, it talks about people will go to and fro on the earth and knowledge will increase. And it's interesting to read their comments about that. And, going to and fro on the earth, they said, well, that was the invention of the locomotive. You see, that's a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, because they were going a lot faster back and forth on the earth. And I just think, okay, that was more than 100. I think it was the spike or bringing the 2 railroads together. That was in 1869. And I said, here you have people, when they see technology take place, they blame it on the devil. It's something to do with the devil. And yet the greatest scientists and some of the greatest inventors in history have been Christians and saw what they were doing as beneficial to the world based upon their relationship with Jesus Christ. Samuel F.
We're out of time, Guy. I can hear the music. But listen, it's a real pleasure speaking to you. Your book is very well.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio.